One was born in a palace, the other in a poor, dirty street. But when fate made them change places, they both learned what it truly means to be a king. Chapter 1. Two Boys, Two Worlds. Tom Canty was born one autumn day in London, in the year 1537. His family was very poor and did not want another baby. On the same day, another boy was born, Edward Tudor, the son of King Henry VIII. Everyone in England wanted this child. At last, the country had a prince. Rich and poor people all over England sang, danced, and celebrated. The baby prince slept in a soft bed, watched carefully by important lords and ladies, but no one talked about the other baby, Tom Canty, who lay in dirty clothes just a few miles away. 9 years later, London was a large city for that time, with more than 100,000 people. The streets were narrow and dirty, and the houses were made of wood. The Canty family lived in a tiny old house on a street called Offal Court. Many poor families lived there too. The Cantys had only one room. Tom's parents slept in a bed in the corner, but Tom and his sisters, Bet and Nan, slept on the floor. Bet and Nan were kind girls, and their mother was gentle and good, but their father was cruel. He was a thief and a beggar. Every day Tom had to go out and beg for money or food, and when he came home with nothing, his father beat him. Even so, Tom was not always unhappy. All the fathers in Offal Court were bad to their children, and Tom's life was like theirs. At night, his kind mother often gave him a small piece of bread. There was also old Andrew, a kind old man who taught the children to behave well. He taught Tom to read and write, and told him stories about kings, palaces, and princes. Soon Tom dreamed of that wonderful world. At night, lying on the floor in his dirty clothes, he imagined himself as a prince in a grand palace. He had one great wish, to see a real prince. He thought about it every day, and dreamed about it every night. One morning, Tom was very hungry. He walked through the streets until he reached a place he had never seen before. There, in front of him, stood a beautiful building, the King's Palace at Westminster. Maybe I'll see a prince today, he thought. Guards stood at the gates, and many people waited outside to see the king. Poor Tom, dressed in rags, went closer to the gate. Suddenly he saw something amazing. A young boy came out of the palace. Servants surrounded him, and his clothes and hat were covered with gold and jewels. It was the real prince! Tom pressed his face against the gate to see better, but a guard pushed him away roughly. "Go away, beggar!" the guard shouted. The crowd laughed, but the prince saw everything. He ran to the gate, his face full of anger. "Do not hurt that boy," he cried. "Open the gates and bring him inside." The soldier obeyed. Prince Edward Tudor, son of the king, took Tom Canty's hand. "You look hungry," said the prince kindly. "Come with me." Edward took Tom to a beautiful room in the palace and told his servants to bring food for him. And what wonderful food it was, just like the kind in fairy tales. When the servants left, Edward turned to Tom and asked, "What is your name, boy?" "My name is Tom Canty, sir." "And where do you live, Tom Canty?" "In a poor street called Offal Court, sir." "Do you have a family?" asked Edward. "Yes, sir," said Tom. "I have a mother and 2 sisters, and a father too. But he is not a good man. I'm sorry to say that." "Is he unkind to you?" asked Edward. "Yes, sir. He hits me and everyone else," Tom replied sadly. Edward's face grew angry. "Then tonight he shall be a prisoner in the Tower of London," he said. "My father will—" "Please, sir," Tom said quickly. "He is a poor man. The Tower of London is only for great and important people." Edward thought for a moment. "That is true," he said. "Tell me, what do you do every day in this awful court?" "I play with my friends," said Tom. "We sing and dance. In summer we swim in the river, and we run and fight in the mud." Edward smiled. "I wish I could take off my shoes and play in the mud just once, and I wish I could wear a prince's clothes," said Tom. "Just once? Then you shall," said Edward. "Let's change clothes." A few minutes later, Prince Edward was wearing Tom's old rags, and Tom was dressed in the prince's fine clothes. They stood before a large mirror, and what a surprise! They looked exactly the same. Edward laughed. "We have the same hair, the same eyes, the same face, even the same voice. Who could tell that you are not the prince?" Edward took Tom's arm, but Tom cried out softly. "That soldier hurt you," said Edward angrily. "Oh, it's nothing," began Tom, but Edward was already upset. "He did a terrible thing, and he will be punished," the prince said. He ran toward the door, then stopped. He picked up a large ring from the table and tried to lock it in a cupboard, but the door would not open. So he hid the ring under the carpet in the corner of the room and ran out toward the palace gate, his face red with anger. "You there, soldier, come here!" Edward shouted. The soldier turned and hit him hard on the ear. "Take that, beggar," he said. "That's for getting me in trouble with the prince earlier." "I am the prince!" Edward cried. But the soldier only laughed at the boy in rags and pushed him outside the gate. "Go away, you silly beggar," he said, slamming the gate shut. "Open the gate at once," shouted Edward. "I am Prince Edward." But the crowd only laughed and pushed him around. "Make way! Here comes Prince Edward!" they shouted, laughing loudly. Chapter 2. The Boy Who Said He Was a Beggar. Inside the palace, Tom waited in the prince's room. At first he had fun. He looked at himself in the mirror, holding the prince's sword. He sat in all the beautiful chairs and touched the rich curtains. But after half an hour, Tom began to feel afraid. "What will happen if someone finds me here in these clothes?" he thought. "The prince isn't here to explain. They will think I'm a thief and they'll kill me." Just then the door opened, and a servant said, "The Lady Jane Grey." Edward's cousin, Lady Jane, came into the room. When she saw Tom's pale, worried face, she said kindly, "What's wrong, my prince?" I am not a prince," Tom said. "I am only poor Tom Canty from Offal Court, a beggar boy. Please don't be angry. Give me back my old clothes, and I will go home." Lady Jane gasped in shock. "What are you saying?" she cried. Then she turned and ran out of the room. "There is no hope for me now," thought Tom. "They'll come and take me away." Soon news spread through the whole palace, from servant to servant and from lord to lady. Everyone whispered the same thing. "The prince has gone mad. He says he's a beggar." A little later, the doors opened again, and a servant came in. "Your father, King Henry VIII, wishes to see you," he said. Tom followed the servant through the grand halls of the palace. Important men, servants, and doctors walked beside him. At last he entered a large and beautiful room. On the bed sat a very fat man with grey hair, wearing rich but old clothes. "Are you well, my son?" the man asked softly. Tom fell to the floor, frightened. "Please don't hurt me, great king," he cried. "I am only a poor boy. Please, I don't want to die." "Come here," said King Henry. "You are not well. The king gently took Tom's face in his hands and looked into his eyes. "Do not be afraid," he said kindly. "Don't you know your father?" Then he spoke to Tom in French. "I don't know that language, sir," said Tom. The king fell back on his bed and cried out, "It's true! My son is mad!" He held Tom close for a moment, then looked around the room with angry eyes. "My son is mad, but he will soon be better," he said. "No one in this palace must speak of this, or they will go to the Tower of London. My son will be the next King of England. We must sign all the papers to make him the Prince of Wales." "Sir," said one of the lords, "only the Duke of Norfolk can sign those papers, but he is already in the Tower." "Be silent!" shouted the king. "My son will not wait for that man. We will sign the papers ourselves, and the Duke of Norfolk will be executed." Tom turned pale when he heard this. "You are very kind to me, sir," he said quietly. "But I don't want anyone to die." "Don't worry about these things, my prince," said the king. "Go back to your room now and rest." When the servants led Tom back to his room, he walked slowly. This was not the palace of his dreams, he thought sadly. It was a prison made of gold. After 1 o'clock, servants dressed Tom in fine clothes and brought him to a beautiful room. A large table stood there with only one chair. Everything on the table was made of gold. Servants stood all around, waiting to serve him. They all knew the prince was not well, so they did not look surprised when he ate with his fingers or asked, "What are these? Can I eat them?" While pointing at the vegetables. After the meal, the servants whispered softly, "Our poor prince." That afternoon, King Henry VIII woke up from a bad dream. "I feel weaker every day," he thought. "I will die soon, but the Duke of Norfolk must die before me." His eyes were cold and angry. When Lord Hertford, one of his most important men, entered the room, the king said, "Execute Norfolk tomorrow. Bring me the Great Seal so I can sign the papers and send him to his death." Lord Hertford looked down at the floor and spoke carefully. "You remember, sir," he said softly. "You gave the Great Seal to Prince Edward 2 days ago." "Oh, yes," said the king slowly. "I remember now. I forget so many things these days. Go and fetch it quickly." Lord Hertford hurried to the prince's rooms, but soon returned without the seal. "I am sorry, sir," said Hertford. "The prince cannot remember where it is. Shall I ask the servants to search his room?" "No," said the king sadly. "Do not trouble the poor boy." Then he lay back on his bed, tired and weak. That night, a grand royal banquet was planned for the prince at the Guildhall. At 7 o'clock, the servants came to dress Tom in fine clothes. By 9 o'clock, 50 royal boats waited on the river in front of the palace. They were decorated with gold and silver. Bright lights shone in the palace gardens, and thousands of people stood along the River Thames, waiting to see their prince. Slowly, the great lords and ladies came through the palace gates and walked down to their boats. The sound of a trumpet filled the air, and a loud cry followed. "Make way for Prince Edward!" The crowds cheered when Tom appeared. He wore a coat of white, silver, and gold, decorated with jewels. Beside him walked Lady Jane Grey and the prince's sister, Princess Elizabeth. Together they moved past the servants and stepped into their boat. Soft music played as the boats glided down the river. The lights from the boats sparkled like jewels on the water. To Princess Elizabeth and Lady Jane, it was an ordinary royal event. But to Tom, who was born in rags in Offal Court, It felt like a dream come true. What a different world this was. When the boats reached the Guildhall, Tom, Princess Elizabeth, and Lady Jane rode on horseback through the streets to the banquet. Inside, they sat at a grand table covered with gold plates and cups. Lords and ladies stood behind their chairs ready to serve them. When Lord Hertford leaned close and whispered something in Tom's ear, he stood up and drank from a golden cup. At once the banquet began. Chapter 3. The Prince in the Poor Man's House. Now let us go back to that morning and to poor little Prince Edward. The people outside the palace laughed at him and pushed him along. They hit him, and he was soon many miles from home. When he was alone, he looked around. I do not know this place, he thought. Edward had no shoes and his feet were cut. He washed them, then kept walking. He walked all day. He was hungry and cold, and his face and hands were bloody. Night was coming. I must find Offal Court. Edward told himself, if I find Tom's family, they will take me to the palace. They can tell the soldiers that I am Prince Edward. At that moment, a big man grabbed his arm from behind and shouted, "There you are!" The man was hard and ugly, and he wore rags. "You haven't brought home any money, have you?" The man said, "I'll beat you when we get back." Edward looked at the angry face. "You are his father," he cried. "I'm your father," John Canty shouted. "I am tired of this." Edward said, "Take me to the king, to my father, and you will be rich." "Are you mad?" Canty shouted. He pulled Edward down a narrow street toward Offal Court. Edward fought, but Canty was too strong. "Stop that!" Canty cried, and he raised a big stick to hit Edward. Suddenly an old man tried to stop Canty. Canty hit the old man hard on the head, and the man fell into the mud. A few minutes later, Edward and John Canty were inside the Cantys' small, dirty room. The place had little light. 2 girls and a woman sat in the corner. "Now then," Canty said, "tell us your true name, or you will be sorry." "Do not tell me to speak," said the little prince, his face hot with anger. "I am Prince Edward." Canty laughed, but his eyes were cold. The woman ran to Edward. "My poor boy," she cried. "You read too many stories about princes." Edward looked at her kindly. "Your son is well, and he is not mad," he said softly. "Take me to the palace, and the king will bring him to you." When Canty heard this, he hit Edward hard on the back. Edward fell into Mrs. Canty's arms. She tried to stand between him and Canty, but Edward pushed away. "Don't stop him," Edward warned her, "or he will hit you too." That night, Edward lay on the floor in great pain. Tom's mother touched his hair and cried softly. "My father the king will thank you for this," Edward told her. When she heard that, she began to cry more. Edward soon slept, but Tom's mother stayed awake, worrying. "He looks like my Tom, but something is different," she thought. "How can I know he is my son?" Then she remembered. When Tom was surprised, he always put his hands over his eyes. She decided to test him. She woke Edward 3 times that night, but each time his hands did not move. "Mad people can forget things," she thought, but can their hands forget? The Cantys slept only a little. Later that night, someone knocked on the door. "What is it?" John Canty shouted angrily. "You hit old Andrew in the street," said the voice outside. "He's dying." Canty's face went white. "We must leave this house," he shouted. "Get up and run!" 5 minutes later, the Cantys and Edward were running through the dark streets of London. "We can never go back there," John Canty cried. "Never again!" He held Edward's arm and dragged him on. The streets were dark, but when they reached the Thames there were lights and many people. "Meet me later on London Bridge," Canty told Tom's mother and sisters. Then he lost them in the crowd. He still held Edward's hand. "The people and lights are for my banquet," thought Edward. "But how can there be a banquet without me?" Then he understood. Tom Canty was at the banquet. Tom Canty was taking his place. Just then a man walked into the group, and Canty dropped Edward's hand for a second. Edward pulled free and ran into the crowd. "I will go to the Guildhall and tell them about that beggar," he told himself. "He will be punished for this." Chapter 4. The Brave Friend. It was midnight, and inside the Guildhall people were dancing. Men and women wore clothes from many countries. Tom saw lords in yellow Russian coats, ladies in green from Morocco, and Turkish dancers in red and gold. Everything seemed like a wonderful dream to him. But the real little prince stood outside the Guildhall gates in rags. "Let me in!" he shouted. "I am Prince Edward." The crowd thought this was funny and moved closer to watch the boy. "Now listen to me, you dogs!" the prince cried, his eyes full of tears. "I am Prince Edward," a voice answered kindly. "Prince or not, you are a brave boy. Now you have a friend. I am Miles Hendon." A tall, strong man pushed through the crowd and stood by Edward. He wore a soldier's uniform and carried a sword. "Kill him!" someone shouted, and the crowd pushed forward. Miles Hendon drew his sword and fought bravely. Men fell here and there, and the crowd started to push back. Then an officer shouted, "Make way for the king's horses!" Soldiers rode their horses through the crowd and up to the Guildhall gates. People ran away, and Miles Hendon picked up the prince and carried him to safety. Soon they were far from the noise. Inside the Guildhall, a trumpet sounded above the music. Everyone became silent. An officer cried, "The king is dead." For a few moments the room was still and quiet. Then all eyes turned to Tom. The crowd shouted loudly. "Long live the king!" they cried. Tom looked at the faces around him. Hundreds watched and waited for him to speak. He asked Lord Hertford quietly, "If I tell the people to do something, will they do it?" "Of course, sir," Hertford answered. "You are the king now. Your word is the law." Tom spoke loudly and clearly. "There will be no more blood while I am king. Go to the Tower of London and tell the soldiers this. The king says the Duke of Norfolk will not die." People all around the room cheered and cried out, "No more blood! Long live Edward VI, King of England!" Chapter 5. The Little King and His Protector. When Miles and Edward finally left the crowd at the Guildhall, they ran through the streets toward the river. At London Bridge more people were there, and Edward heard the news shouted by many voices. "King Henry is dead!" Tears came into Edward's eyes. Many people had been afraid of King Henry, but to Edward the king had been a kind and loving father. For a moment Edward felt very alone. Then the shouts changed to, "Long live King Edward VI! I am king now," he thought. The thought felt strange and wonderful. Miles was taking Edward to an inn where he had a room. But as they crossed the road, John Canty stopped them. "You will not get away from me again," Canty said, grabbing Edward. "I'll beat you." "Let go of him," cried Miles. "What has the boy done to you?" "He's my son," Canty answered angrily. "That is not true," Edward cried. "I would rather die than go with him." Miles put his hand on his sword. "Father or not, you shall not touch this boy," he said, "or you will be sorry." Canty shouted and walked away into the crowd. Miles took Edward into the inn. In Miles's room, the little king fell onto the bed. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and he was very tired. "Wake me when my food is ready," he told Miles, and he fell asleep at once. Miles laughed softly. "He comes into my room and takes my bed with no please or thank you. He calls himself a prince and wants to live like one. Poor mad little beggar. But I will be his friend. I like him and the way he talks. I will teach him and look after him." When Edward woke, there was food on the table. He sat and began to eat. "Bring me water," he said. Miles brought a cup and pulled a chair to sit. But Edward cried angrily, "Do not sit at the king's table." Miles almost laughed but stayed standing. He thought, "This mad boy will bring me trouble," and quietly waited while Edward finished eating. "Tell me about yourself," Edward asked between bites. "I am the son of Sir Richard Hendon of Hendon Hall," Miles answered. 10 years ago I went to France to fight for the king. There I was taken prisoner. I escaped a few months ago and just returned to England. I planned to go to Hendon Hall to see my family." "You will see your family soon," said Edward. "But I will never see my father again." He had tears in his eyes. Then he told Miles how a beggar had taken his place at the palace. "He may be mad, but he tells a good story," Miles thought. Edward stopped and looked at Miles. "Last night you saved the King of England," he said. "You were kind to me. Now I will do something for you. What do you want?" Miles smiled. What could he ask from a mad boy? Then he thought of something simple. His legs were tired from standing. "Please, sir," he said, "may I sit in the same room as the king?" "Take a seat, Sir Miles Hendon," Edward answered. "From today you will be Sir Miles Hendon, and only you may sit in the king's room." Miles sat down at once. I was right to ask, he thought. My legs hurt already. I would not like to stand for weeks. Later that morning, while Edward slept, Miles went out to buy clothes for him. When Miles returned and opened the door, the room was empty. He ran downstairs in alarm. "A boy brought a note from you, sir," a servant said. He was tall with dark hair. "I gave the note to your friend. It said you were waiting in Suffolk." They left together. "I wrote no note, you foolish man!" Miles shouted. "Was the boy alone?" The servant thought a moment. "He came alone, sir, but when they went outside, another man followed them. It is that ugly villain who was outside the inn." Miles cried, "My poor mad little king, I will find you." Chapter 6. The Gentle King. When Tom woke up that morning, for one happy moment he thought he was at home again. But then he saw lords and servants standing around his bed, and he remembered. He was still a prisoner and a king. The servants began to dress him. A very important lord handed a sock to the highest soldier in the army. The soldier passed it to the great officer of the Tower of London. Slowly, the sock moved from one important person to another, until, at last, a servant carefully put it on Tom's foot. Then the second sock began its long journey to the king's bed. When Tom was finally dressed in beautiful purple clothes and a fine hat, one servant washed his face, and another gently dried it. After breakfast, a large group of officers and servants took him to the great hall. There, with Lord Hertford beside him, he watched the business of England take place. People came and went, reading long letters and showing important papers. Every now and then, Hertford touched Tom's arm and quietly told him when to sign something. There was a lot of talk about money, and one officer said, The king has not paid his 1,200 servants. Tom sat up suddenly. I don't need 1,200 servants, he cried. Let's move to a smaller house, But Hertford quickly touched his arm, and Tom stopped speaking, his face red with embarrassment. I wish I could be outside in the fields, in the sun. Tom thought sadly. Why must I stay in this place and be a king? Before long, he grew sleepy. When he closed his eyes and fell asleep, everyone in the great hall stopped talking. For a few minutes, while the young king slept, all the business of England stopped too. The days passed, and most of Tom's time was taken by the boring duties of being king. Lord Hertford always told him what to do and say, and Tom tried his best not to make mistakes. Slowly, he began to feel more comfortable in the palace. He still felt like a prisoner sometimes, but less each day, and he started to enjoy being with the king's officers and servants. On the 4th day of his rule, Tom was looking out a window when he saw a crowd near the palace gates. People were shouting angrily, and he became curious. Shall I send a servant down there, sir? Lord Hertford asked. He can find out what's happening. Yes, please, said Tom eagerly. A few minutes later, the servant returned with several officers. They were holding a man. The crowd was following this man, sir, the servant said. He is going to the tower. The soldiers plan to execute him tomorrow. Tom looked closely and thought, I know this man. He's the one who saved Giles Witt on New Year's morning when he fell into the river. What is your crime? Tom asked the prisoner. They say I killed an old man with poison, sir. The man replied. He went to visit a sick man in Islington, said one of the officers. An hour later the man died. Did you find poison in the dead man's room or in this man's pocket? Tom asked. No, sir, said the officer. Then you don't know if this man used poison, or if the old man really died from poison. Tom said sharply. He turned to the prisoner. What do you say? I was not in Islington that day. The man said. I was not taking a life. I was saving one. I saved a boy who fell into the river. When did this crime happen? Tom asked another officer. On New Year's morning, sir. Stand up and go, said Tom. You're free. Then he turned to the officers, his face red with anger. Why were you sending this man to the tower? You found no poison, so you do not know that he killed anyone. Two lords whispered quietly to each other. They say our king is mad, said one. But he doesn't sound mad to me. Chapter 7. Among Thieves and Beggars. Let us go back a few days to find the real king, Edward. He was in Suffolk with the tall, dark-haired boy who had come to the inn for him. Edward sat down by the road, tired and angry. You said Sir Miles Hendon was waiting for us here, he said. I will not walk any farther. He must come to me. He can't, said the boy. He's hurt. Hurt? Why didn't you say so? Then we must go to him at once, said Edward. He followed the boy down the road and into some woods. At last they came to an old barn, and Edward went inside. But the place was empty. Where is Miles? Edward asked. The boy only laughed. Then John Canty appeared. Where are your sisters and mother? Canty shouted angrily. My mother is dead, said Edward calmly. And my sisters are in the palace. My palace. The boy laughed again, but Canty said sharply, Enough of this. Stop talking nonsense or you'll be sorry. Now come here, Hugo. I must speak with you. While Canty spoke quietly to the boy, Edward sat alone in a dark corner of the barn. He thought sadly about his father, the late king, and tears filled his eyes. Remembering happier times, he soon fell asleep. When Edward woke up, it was dark. A fire burned at the far end of the barn, and strange men and women sat around it. They were frightening to look at. Some had only one arm, one leg, or one eye. Others had scars or burns on their faces. All were dirty and looked like villains. They were thieves, beggars, and even killers. Edward watched them quietly as they finished eating and began to laugh and talk. "I was a farmer once," one man said sadly. "I had a wife and 3 children. My mother helped sick people in our village, but one day an old man died, and his family said she killed him. Soldiers came and killed her. They took our farm. We had nothing left, so we begged for food. But in England, begging is against the law. They caught my wife and killed her, too. When they caught me, they cut off my ears. I kept begging. I had no choice. My children died from hunger, and when they catch me again, they will execute me." Edward stood up, his face pale. "They shall not execute you," he cried. "I will stop them." Everyone turned to look at him. "And who are you?" They laughed. "I am Edward, King of England," he said proudly. The thieves burst into loud laughter. "Be careful," said a man with burns on his face. "If the king's officers hear you say that, they will kill you." "Let's call him Foo-Foo the First King of the Moon," a woman joked, and everyone laughed again. "Long live King Foo-Foo!" they shouted, laughing. They lifted Edward's arms, placed him on a pile of boxes like a throne, and put a plate on his head as a crown. "Be kind to us, King Foo-Foo," they cried. "Let us be your servants." "I tried to be kind," thought Edward sadly, tears running down his cheeks. "But this is how they treat me." The next morning, the gang left the woods and walked east. They shouted at people on the road and stole from farms, but no one tried to stop them. Everyone was afraid. By early afternoon, they reached a village. The gang split into small groups to beg or steal. Hugo went with Edward. "There's nothing to steal here," Hugo said after watching for a while. "We'll have to beg." "I will not beg or steal," said Edward firmly. "Your father says you've begged on the streets of London all your life," laughed Hugo. "Don't be foolish," said Edward angrily. "Now listen," said Hugo. "When I fall down, ask that man for help. Say I'm your brother and that I'm sick. He looks kind. He'll give us money." When the man came near, Hugo fell into the mud and began to cry out. "2 pence for food, sir. I'm sick." "Poor boy," said the man kindly. "You shall have 3 pence." "He's not sick," shouted Edward. "He's a beggar and a thief. He's taken your 3 pence and money from your pocket too." Hugo jumped up and ran away. The man chased after him, calling for help. Edward saw his chance and ran the other way as fast as he could. Chapter 8. The Madman in the Woods. Edward ran away from Hugo and didn't stop until he reached the other side of the village. When the houses were far behind him, he kept walking for several hours. Hungry and tired, he came to a farmhouse and knocked on the door to ask for help. "Go away, beggar!" shouted the farmer when he saw Edward's rags. "Go, or I'll call the constable." Edward turned and walked across the fields until he reached a wood. He thought he could walk through it and find a road on the other side, but instead he went deeper and deeper into the forest. As darkness fell, Edward became frightened. He didn't want to spend the night alone in the dark, cold woods. At last he saw a small light shining between the trees. It came from a little stone house. He went to the window and looked inside. There was a fire and a small bed. An old man in rags sat by the fire. When he saw Edward, he stood and opened the door. "Come in, it's cold outside," said the old man. "Who are you?" "I am the king," said Edward. "Come in, king," the man said with a laugh. "Sit by the fire." He put more wood on the fire and brought a chair for Edward. His eyes were wild, and he muttered quietly to himself as he moved around. He washed the cuts on Edward's feet, then cooked some food and gave it to him. Later, he led Edward to another room and made a warm bed for him. "So you're a king?" he asked with a smile. "Of which country?" "Of England," Edward answered. "My father was King Henry VIII. The man's smile disappeared, and his face grew dark. He was silent for a moment. "Do you know," he said quietly, "that your father took my house and the houses of many others?" Edward gave no answer. He had fallen asleep. The old man began to move around the house, searching for something. He whispered to himself as he walked, sometimes stopping to listen or look toward the bed. At last he found what he wanted, an old knife. Sitting by the fire, he stared at it and muttered, "So it was his father who did those terrible things." Then he took some rags and carefully tied Edward's arms and legs to the bed. "King Henry took my house," he whispered. "Now I will take his son." When Edward woke the next morning, he couldn't move. The old man sat beside him on the bed, holding the long knife in his hand. Edward tried to pull himself free, but the rags held him tight. He tried to shout, but another rag covered his mouth. "It's time to die, son of Henry," the man said, raising the knife over Edward's head. Just then, there was a loud knock on the door. The knife fell from the man's hand. Shaking, he threw some rags over Edward. "Open the door," called a voice from outside. The sound was like music to Edward's ears. It was Miles's voice. "I'm looking for a boy," Miles said when the old man opened the door. "A poor boy in rags. I know he went to a farm near here, just beyond the woods." Edward tried to call out, but no sound came through the rag over his mouth. He pulled hard against the ropes, but they would not move. "A poor boy came here last night," said the old man. "I gave him food and he left soon after. He went that way. Come, I'll show you." Edward listened as they walked away. His heart sank, and tears filled his eyes. "My only friend is gone," he thought. "The old man will come back soon, and then—" Just then the door opened again. Edward closed his eyes, sure he would feel the knife at his throat. But when he looked, it wasn't the old man. It was John Canty and Hugo. To his own surprise, Edward felt a rush of relief. A moment later, they untied him and dragged him through the woods. For once, the prince was almost happy to see the two villains. At least they were taking him away from the mad old man. Chapter 9. A Narrow Escape. And so, Edward was once again trapped in the gang of thieves. He refused to beg or steal for them, and every day he looked for a chance to escape from this terrible life. At night, in his dreams, he was back in his palace, clean, warm, and safe. Most of the gang were not cruel to King Foo-Foo, as they jokingly called him, but Hugo was different. It was his job to watch Edward, and he hated the little king. Hugo was always looking for ways to get Edward into trouble. One morning, he and Edward went into a small town. As they walked down the street, a woman passed them carrying a big bag of meat. Hugo suddenly ran behind her, grabbed the bag, and threw it into Edward's arms. "Take it," he shouted, and then ran away. Edward dropped the bag at once, but the woman caught his arm. "Thief!" she cried. "Take your hands off me, woman," said Edward angrily. "I did not steal your bag." But a crowd of angry people gathered around him. "We'll teach you a lesson," said a big man, raising a heavy stick above his head. Just then, a sword touched the man's arm, and a calm voice said, "Good people, go carefully. Let a judge decide this, not you." The crowd moved back, and the woman let go of Edward. Edward turned and saw the man with the sword. "Miles!" he cried with joy. "You've saved me again!" Miles smiled. "Say nothing," he whispered quietly, "and do exactly as I say." A constable soon arrived, and they all followed him to the court, Miles, Edward, the woman, and the crowd. That afternoon, in the town's courtroom, the judge asked, "Did this boy steal from you?" "Yes, sir," said the woman. "He stole some meat." "How much did the meat cost you?" asked the judge. "I paid 44 pence for it," she said. The judge's face grew serious, and Miles's heart sank. But Edward, who didn't know the harsh laws of England, waited quietly. "Leave us," said the judge to the others. Then he turned to the woman and spoke gently. "Good woman, this poor boy may have stolen because he was hungry. But the law says that if someone steals more than 13 pence, he must die." Edward jumped up in shock, but before he could speak, the woman began to tremble. "Oh, no!" she cried. "I don't want that!" The judge looked at her carefully. "I haven't written the cost of the meat in my book yet," he said. "Are you sure it cost 44 pence? The woman hesitated, then stammered. "Oh, no. Yes. I remember now. I paid 8 pence for it." Miles jumped to his feet happily and hugged Edward. The woman left the court with her meat, but she was not alone. The constable followed her outside, and Miles, watching closely, followed them too. "It's a good piece of meat," said the constable. "I'll buy it from you for 8 pence. "You will not," said the woman. "I paid 44 pence for it." "But in court you said it cost only 8, said the constable with a sly smile. "Shall we go tell the judge? Then they'll hang that boy." "No, no," cried the woman. "Here, take it, 8 pence, and say no more." She handed him the meat and hurried away, crying. The constable hid the meat behind a chair and went back inside the courtroom. When Miles returned, the judge was saying, "You will go to prison for 2 weeks." Edward's mouth fell open, but Miles whispered quickly, "Say nothing and follow my lead." It was late in the day when Miles and Edward followed the constable through the quiet streets toward the prison. "Look away," said Miles suddenly. "Then this poor boy can escape." "What did you say?" asked the constable angrily. "Shall I send you to prison too?" Miles stepped closer and said in a low voice, "I saw what happened outside the courtroom. You bought that meat for 8 pence. The king's officers would execute you for that, and I will tell them." The constable turned pale. "No, no, please, sir. Take the boy and go. I'll look away and say nothing." "Good," said Miles. "And you'll return the meat to the woman?" "Yes," the constable promised quickly. "Don't forget," Miles warned him. Then he and Edward ran off down the road and out of the town. As they ran, they talked about everything that had happened. "We must go to Lord Hertford at once," said Edward. "I have to win back my throne." Miles smiled to himself. His poor little head is still full of this dream, he thought. But I must go to London before I return to Hendon Hall, so to London we will go. Chapter 10. The True King Returns. While the real King Edward wandered the country in rags, cold, hungry, and running from thieves and murderers, King Tom Canty was beginning to enjoy palace life. He made fewer mistakes now. When he wanted to talk to Princess Elizabeth or Lady Jane Grey, he called for them. When he was bored, he sent them away. He loved the royal banquets, the music, and the long walks to dinner with rows of servants and guards behind him. He enjoyed his beautiful clothes and asked for more. Soon he had even more servants than King Henry once did. Tom was still a kind ruler and changed many laws to help the poor. But when he was angry, even the bravest lords and officers trembled with fear. At first Tom felt sorry for Edward, the true king, but his new life was full of excitement, and he thought less and less about him. He even began to forget his own family in Offal Court. On the evening of February 19th, 1547, Tom fell asleep in his soft royal bed, happy and content. The next day would be the day of his coronation. That same evening, Edward and Miles arrived at London Bridge. The city was alive with celebration. People were eating, drinking, singing, and dancing in the streets, talking about the coronation of the new king. In the crowd, Edward lost Miles and continued alone toward Westminster Abbey. There, he saw workers carrying things in and out, preparing for the great event. "That beggar will not wear my crown," Edward thought fiercely. When no one was looking, he slipped inside the abbey and hid behind some decorations. Later, when the last workman left, he lay down in a corner and fell asleep. At 7 the next morning, Tom rode through London on a beautiful white horse. Lord Hertford rode beside him, and many lords and servants followed. The streets were full of people and colourful banners. Music filled the air. From every window and every street, voices cried, "Long live the king!" In the crowd stood Tom's mother. When Tom saw her, he was so surprised that he lifted his hands to his eyes, just as he always used to do. His mother saw it and pushed through the people to reach him. "My son, my child!" she cried, touching his leg. An officer pushed her back, and Tom looked down at her and said coldly, "I do not know you, woman." Tom rode on, but the joy of the day was gone. He saw no more of the crowds, heard none of their cheers, only his mother's sad face in his mind. At 9 o'clock, the people inside the abbey heard the sound of guns. The king had arrived. Trumpets played, and soldiers marched down the aisle. Then Tom appeared, dressed in shining golden jewels. Music echoed through the great hall as he walked slowly towards the throne. But as the ceremony went on, Tom's face grew paler, and sadness filled his eyes. At last, the highest lord in the land held the crown above Tom's head. The abbey went silent. And then, suddenly, a barefoot boy in rags ran down the aisle, shouting, "Do not place the crown on that boy's head. I am the king!" Guards rushed forward to stop him, but Tom cried out loudly, "Do not touch him! He is the king!" Everyone froze. The abbey was completely silent. "The king is not well," Hertford whispered to another officer. "Take that beggar away. Do not touch him. He is the king," Tom said again. Edward stepped forward toward the throne. Gasps of surprise filled the abbey. The two boys looked exactly the same. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Hertford turned to Edward. "Will you please answer some questions?" he asked. "Of course," said Edward calmly. Hertford asked question after question about the palace, and Edward answered every one correctly. The people whispered in amazement. "How could a beggar know so much about royal life?" "Your answers are true," said Hertford slowly. "But tell me one last thing. Where is the Great Seal?" "I keep it in the small cupboard in my room," Edward said, without hesitation. "Go there and bring it," Hertford told one of the officers. The officer left at once. Inside the abbey, everyone waited. They looked from Tom to Edward, uncertain what to believe. When the officer returned, he spoke quietly to Hertford. "The seal is not there," Hertford announced. "Soldiers, remove this boy from the church. Do not touch him, or you will pay with your life," shouted Tom suddenly. Hertford turned to the officer again. "Did you look carefully? That golden seal can decide who is king." "The seal is a big gold ring?" asked Tom, jumping up. "Then I know where it is, but I did not put it there." He looked at Edward. "Do you remember, sir? After we changed clothes, you went to speak to the soldier at the gate. Before you left, you tried to lock the cupboard, but couldn't. So you hid it under the carpet in the corner of the room." A smile spread across Edward's face. "Yes, I remember now." The officer rode back to the palace. Inside the abbey, the crowd waited anxiously. Then at last the officer ran in, holding the Great Seal high above his head. A great cry rose through the abbey. "Long live the true king!" Trumpets played. People cheered. Edward, still in rags, stood proudly smiling. "Take that boy to the tower," said Hertford, taking Tom by the arm. But Edward stopped him. "Do not harm him," he said. "I have won back my crown, and he helped me. No one must touch him." Servants gently removed Tom's golden clothes and dressed Edward as a king once more. Then the coronation began again. England had its true king at last, and the sound of guns spread the joyful news across all of London. Chapter 11. The King and His Servant. Miles Hendon walked for hours through the poorest and dirtiest streets of London, searching for Edward, but he could not find him anywhere. Tired at last, he sat down by the River Thames to rest. Soon he heard the sound of guns from the coronation, and then he fell asleep. When he woke the next morning, he suddenly remembered the noise. "My poor, mad boy must have gone to the palace," he thought. He stood up quickly and began walking there. Just before 11 o'clock, Miles arrived at the palace. When he reached the gates, a soldier stepped forward and looked at him carefully. "Are you Sir Miles Hendon?" the soldier asked. "I am Miles Hendon, but not a sir," he replied. "Follow me, please," said the soldier. "The king wishes to see you." Miles was worried as he followed the soldier through the grand halls. "What have I done? Why does the king want to see me?" he wondered. At last they entered the great hall. Miles took off his hat and followed the soldier towards the throne. He was nervous until the king turned his head. Miles froze in shock. "It can't be true," he thought. His poor, mad little friend, the beggar boy, was sitting on the throne of England. "I'm dreaming," Miles whispered to himself. But the boy on the throne looked real, and the great lords around him looked real too. "How can I be sure it's him?" Miles thought. Then he remembered something. He quietly pulled up a chair and sat down. At once loud voices filled the hall. "Stand up, you fool!" shouted one of the guards. "No one sits in front of the king!" But Edward suddenly stood and raised his hand. "Do not touch him," he said firmly. "This man is my true servant. He saved my life with his sword. For that, I made him Sir Miles Hendon. Sir Miles, and only Sir Miles, may sit before the king." his children and their children and their children after them may do the same." Miles's face broke into a smile. "Then it really is my pauper, my little beggar boy," he cried. "My soldiers found you," said Edward, smiling. "I knew you would come to the palace looking for me, so I told them to bring you." At that moment, there was a noise at the other end of the hall. A servant entered, bringing Tom Canty before the king. Edward turned to face him. "I have heard that you were a good and kind ruler," Edward said kindly. "I am pleased with you. We will care for your mother and sisters, and from this day forward you shall be Sir Tom, so that everyone will remember you were once a king." The servants led Tom out of the hall. He was full of joy and ran off to find his mother to tell her the good news. And so we leave King Edward in his great palace. He did not live for many years, but while he was king he worked hard to help his people. He found the judge who once saved him when Hugo stole the meat, and made him an important man. He also found the poor farmer from the gang of thieves, rescued him, and gave him a comfortable home. Under Edward's rule, many beggars and thieves escaped execution, and cruel laws were changed. Sometimes a great lord would say, "Our laws are already kind to the poor, your majesty. You do not need to change them." But Edward always looked at them and replied, "What do you know of life as a pauper? My people and I know, but you do not." King Edward often told the story of his adventures, and how he nearly missed his own coronation because he was fast asleep on the floor in Westminster Abbey. He stayed close friends with Tom Canty and Miles Hendon for the rest of his short life. Miles returned home to Hendon Hall and soon married. Tom lived a long and happy life, and his mother and sisters were cared for, but no one ever saw John Canty again. Everyone in London knew Tom Canty as Sir Tom. When people saw him in the street, they stopped and said, "That man was once a king. Take off your hat to him." If you believe that kindness makes a true king, not a crown, then click like, share this story, and subscribe for more tales of courage, hope, and heart. Long live the two kings and the power of compassion.